Different. Chapter 1. What does it matter where my body is? My mind is still going on. White Knight from Alice in the Looking Glass. Your reality is what you think it is, in essence. Cogito ergo sum. So, what do you think when you see something that can't be real? That was the question I asked myself when Curtis flew over my left wing. I had never encountered an ancient warbird in flight, especially one as unusual as the warhawk, so I waved and smiled in greeting. He flapped his wings and pointed toward the coast, visible on the western horizon. I shrugged embarrassedly and pointed the pilot over my left shoulder to my destination. He gestured again, this time very affirmatively. I gave him the finger. The flight from the Bahamas to Lauderdale had been routine up to that point, but a thunderstorm had developed over the destination. So I waited out the ATC ground stop, traveling on a lazy 346-degree heading, intending to turn onto Vector 241 when the stop was lifted. The weather was beautiful, and I was enjoying the splendor of the ocean as I flew over the Sargasso Sea. Then clouds started to appear in front of me, and I crossed to 14,000 feet, which was close to my ceiling. But a strange formation followed me, and I flew into thick fog while performing IFR. That's when the turbulence started. The up and down jolts and wild yawing tossed the Cherokee around like a canoe in a North Atlantic storm. My life was flashing before my eyes as I watched the altitude and roll indicators, trying to stay in the right direction. Then suddenly, the chaos ended, the fog disappeared, and I found myself in clear blue air. At that moment, my new friend joined me. He swerved and disappeared, only to appear above me and behind me. With those words, he fired a stream of tracers at the front of the Cherokee. I had no idea what this jackass was up to, but I was furious. I immediately regrouped in the direction he pointed and began to descend. We'll settle this on the ground, maybe with a kick in the ass. I met Kat at a frat party. I didn't belong among the erudite, aspiring alcoholics. I was too introverted to feel comfortable in a seething pack of macho men. But I was an athlete, a swimmer, and frat rats like to throw jocks around at their parties. It keeps up the illusion that they're all clean-looking and clean hands. Even so, by inviting me, they must have been scraping the bottom of the barrel. The guys they usually invited played team sports like soccer, baseball, and basketball. Among them was my roommate, Todd McGonigal. He stood in the center of the room, impressing a gaggle of sorority girls with overblown tales of Saturday night legerdemain. Ironically, my roommate was a typical college quarterback, at least for that era. 6 feet and maybe 190 pounds. Not surprisingly, he was built like a Greek god, broad-shouldered, narrow-waisted, and played collision sports. Todd's dancing Irish eyes, handsome face, and full head of curly blonde hair completed the image of the great American hero. It was disgusting, whereas I, a humble aquatic creature, was 4 inches taller and 30 pounds heavier and streamlined like a barracuda with a shaved head to get that extra 100th of a second. Worse, instead of showing off my daring deeds every Saturday, I was practicing a solitary sport where success is measured by how agonizingly you can get to the pool wall first. Todd was watched by thousands, while I was lucky enough to have 100 spectators, most of whom were my significant other. Unfortunately, I didn't have a significant other. It's hard to get a woman when you spend 3 agonizing hours a day, 6 days a week, shuttling back and forth in a chlorine-soaked environment. Swimming got me into college, but there is no pot of gold at the end of the rainbow for small athletes. So I took full advantage of my chance with a solid degree. Todd, on the other hand, was already interviewing agents, which is why my roommate was performing in front of an adoring flock of female students, while I stood next to the paneling, leaning against an absolutely incredible grand piano that stood in the corner of the house's huge living room. As far as I knew, no one played the piano, but it gave the place an air of class and sophistication. College socializing is the impression you leave. At that moment, a sweet voice from somewhere from under my left elbow said, "Are you as bored as I am?" I looked down and saw the pixie leaning against the piano next to me. Had she really been here all this time? It was dark in the back of the party, and she was quite tiny. Maybe I'd missed her. I looked her over, naturally. That's not polite. But seriously, I'm a guy. She had a gorgeous round face, framed by a thick mop of blonde hair, huge blue eyes, a small snub nose, and an almost seductive mouth. Sort of. Tinkerbell as a sorority girl. She was no more than 5 feet tall. She was dressed in an appropriate outfit for the occasion. A dark blue sleeveless t-shirt with the Alpha Phi crest on the left side, a pair of white shorts, and topsiders on prominent, well-tanned legs. I think I even licked my lips. I said, "I'm only here because Captain America brought me." I nodded toward Todd, who was currently doing the can-can, throwing his arms around the shoulders of a couple blonde cheerleaders and watching all the bobbing and bouncing, showing off. "I was hoping he'd blow up his knee," Pixie said in her sweet melodic voice. "I had to come because they make all the newbies attend, but I can leave at any time. How about treating me to a burger at the Brown Jug?" Apparently, God exists. My new friend was a riot of color under the garish fluorescent lights of this eatery. Shiny golden blonde hair, sparkling blue eyes, and bright red lipstick. I had never been in this establishment with such a stunningly beautiful woman. We barely spoke as we walked. It was hard to hear her because the top of her head was below my shoulder. We chatted just long enough to exchange names. Her name was Catherine, but she was always known as Kat. She was 20 years old and a freshman-sophomore in a sorority. The fact that she was from Grosse Pointe made it possible to find out all the socio-economic details. It also made me nervous. My roots are deeply rural, Howell, Michigan. So I immediately realized that I was way out of my league, at least as far as social gatherings were concerned. This led to the obvious question. We were just getting settled in the booth when I looked up at her beautiful round face and asked, "Do I know you?" There had to be some rational explanation for this miracle. She gave me a cute grin and said, "I attend all of the university's house meetings." Okay, that explains it. "Todd may look great in all his loincloths, but you have no secrets when you're standing on blocks in a tiny Speedo. Plus, given my height and build, I swim distances, 200 and 500. Thus, I was on view much longer than the sprinters. Apparently, she liked what she saw. I asked her why she went to the meetings. She replied that it was to see her brother. I had yet to learn the last name. So I asked, "Who is your brother?" She smiled and said, "Brad Wilson." Everything fell into place. Brad was number 2 in the competition I was competing in. So his little sister Kat watched me get my ass handed to him on a regular basis. I defended myself. "Don't hold it against me." She smirked and replied, "Maybe. We'll see." Oh shit. I knew what I was talking about. There was so much more to this Pixie than an angelic face and a graceful body. I said, trying to steer the conversation in a direction that was less likely to make me blush. "I'm in engineering school, civil engineering. I want to build things. What are you studying?" Without blinking an eye, she replied, "Theoretical physics." Then she added, "Well, I'm only a sophomore, but I'm taking all the higher math and linear algebra courses. I want to be an astronaut, so I'm also in the Air Force ROTC squadron. I don't get a scholarship, but I serve with them." I just sat there with my mouth open. The woman may have been petite, but there was nothing small about her. I asked, "How do you manage to combine all the necessary study time with the cleanup and polishing you need to pass your military background check?" She shrugged smugly and said, "Math isn't hard, and if you keep up with uniforms and equipment, it doesn't take much time. But gym class takes up a chunk of my day, so you have to be disciplined." I went back to imitating Tuna. This little woman, actually a girl, was clearly a genius with none of the classic nerd tendencies. I could see the ROTC nerds running around campus in grey t-shirts and shorts. She must have been part of that pack. And I thought I was Superman, doing a full load of engineering while also participating in Big Ten sports. Then this woman shook me to the core. She gave me a look that had nothing girlish or nerdy about it and said, "Let's cut to the chase." "Okay. Thanks to Brad, you've been a part of my life for some time now, and I've always admired you. You don't know me, but I can assure you that I'm keeping up. So, what do you think? Should we go out?" She was asking me who I thought she was, and again, she was 2 steps in front of me. I said, "I am an engineer, dear, not a theoretical physicist. We are working in the here and now. Please explain to me what coming together means to you." She gave me a beaming smile and said, "You're not that stupid. I know I'm attractive, and you're just handsome. We'd be perfect for each other. We should explore that." This little woman just handed me the line that most guys use for dating. I didn't know about the hum part, but she absolutely said she was attractive. In fact, she was a miniature Barbie, stunningly beautiful, like a doll, with a voluptuous body. I was alarmingly certain that I could never in my life achieve more than she did. Of course, the fact that Kat had taken all the first steps was frightening. But a woman of her character and intelligence wouldn't delay, waiting to be swept off her feet. Pool decks aren't kid-friendly places, and she'd been watching me for months, so she had the advantage of knowing me, at least superficially, how I interacted with others and what motivated me. On the other hand, I'd known Kat for about an hour and a half. Nevertheless, I already knew the 3 most important things about her, which is all you need if you're a guy. She was smart, beautiful, and interested in me. There was only one more thing I needed to know. I said, "Well, this is unexpected, but I agree that we should explore this further. So how about you come over to my place?" She said firmly, "No, we need to go to my place. I don't have a roommate, and I'm a bit of a screamer." I quickly discovered that Kat is more of a wildcat than a cat. Smart women have all the intimate desires that their less intelligent sisters have, but they also have creativity, a vivid imagination, and a need to discover new things, not to mention the passion of their fiery souls. We didn't make it 3 feet to the door before Kat dropped something, pulled out what she was looking for, and started devouring ice cream on a scorching day. The sensations made it problematic to get up. So after a couple seconds, I grabbed her under the arms and lifted her to her feet. There was a mask of lust and disappointment on her face. I hissed, frustrated, "Dopey!" She went back on the attack as soon as my ass was down on the plush leather cushions. From the sounds of it, she was enjoying herself as much as I was. I wondered, do women really enjoy doing things like this? I know. I was pretty naive back then. I was getting to the point where the monstrous forces were about to break loose when she grabbed the object of her affection to stop what was about to happen and sat staring at it, panting loudly. Kat was Venus herself, except that her firm little body was better than anything Alexandros of Antioch had ever carved. Then the panting got louder. When she reached my shirt, buttons flew off in different directions. Her predatory look said that she was not afraid of anything in this sphere. How could I be so lucky? I grabbed her, and we had our first kiss. She looked like a woman on a mission. For a moment, she froze between us. We looked into each other's eyes. Then her eyes rolled back. What followed was 20 minutes of yapping, back scratching and biting, proof that Kat was indeed a cat. It was that dreamy moment in your lives when you both realized that this was the beginning of your life's passion. There would be no going back from here. We ended with me standing up, holding her cheeks, and me walking hard toward the metaphorical light at the end of the tunnel. She'd done this so many times already that my only goal was to get to the finish line. When that moment came, she screamed in my ear. Then the entire universe shrank to the singularity that preceded the Big Bang, only to expand outward in a cataclysmic outburst. Kat let out a loud cry of surprise, then collapsed. I pressed her dead body against me to end the inevitable. I moved the love of my life onto the couch, and she hung limply with her head thrown back. She must have weighed 95 pounds, so it was easy to lay her down gently. Her eyes opened, and she looked confused. Then I saw her powerful mind take control, and she said with a mischievous smile, "I'll never let you go." And that was the bottom line. We would be together forever. Our courtship was unimportant. It took a long time until we really got to know each other, but we enjoyed every minute of this journey and were inseparable. Even though our coming together was rather sudden and unexpected, at least on my part. Neither of us ever doubted the value and benefit of our choices. We had found each other. Kat was a complex woman, brilliant, driven, and passionate. At the same time, she could be soft, loving, and kittenish. I never doubted her devotion to me, and tried very hard to live up to her gift. The moment was amazing, but it was the least of our relationship. We nourished our friendship. Life is not easy. But having a capable and trustworthy companion makes it so much easier. The next 6 years passed in the usual vicissitudes of life. I was a year ahead of Kat. I graduated from high school and got a job with a local construction firm. That's when Kat had her fairy tale wedding. Her parents had money. Her brother Brad was my best man. It seemed fitting, since he was the indirect reason we met. Kat received her doctorate in theoretical physics. It took another 5 years to get that degree. My wife was very smart. Her commitment to the Air Force was fulfilled by a contract with the NASA Aerospace Research Center on campus, where she did things related to light amplification. Please don't ask me what that was. I'm an engineer, not a scientist. Life seemed perfect, and then it got even better. We talked about kids. We both liked them, but we were in the early stages of our careers. Nevertheless, once we were both immersed in the pleasant routine of married life, we decided to try for a baby. Of course, my capable little wife immediately produced one. My darling baby Piper was the light of my life. She was what women call an easy child, beautiful like her mother and full of smiles. My daughter was walking by 1 year old and talking by 2, and she especially loved her daddy. I took her everywhere, even to work, wearing a miniature yellow construction helmet over her beautiful blonde curls. She wore it proudly because Daddy had given it to her. I adored her in return. She and her mom were my entire existence, the only thing I truly cared about. That's why it was especially hard when a drunk on a gas tanker truck drove over the center line and killed them both. They were on their way to get ice cream, a simple decision on an ordinary day. I imagined them laughing happily and singing a song as they drove down the busy highway. Eyewitnesses say the fireball was huge. Kat and Piper were trapped in the mangled wreckage of our brand new SUV. The first responders assured me that my loved ones were dead before the explosion. They tell you that so you don't think about the alternative. The other vehicle was a semi, so the driver got out before it happened. He didn't have a scratch on him. Fatal car accidents happen every day. You just have to be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Life is random and unspeakably cruel. But for everyone else, the world keeps turning, and their world stays the same. And me? I was so distraught, they put me in an asylum until I pulled myself together. Kat's family sicked a pack of lawyers on the hapless company owners. They knew their driver was prone to daytime drinking. I got almost $30 million, most of it in punitive damages. The ghostly shell of a man sitting at the plaintiff's table became a living argument to the jury. The driver got a 12-year sentence for special circumstance manslaughter. And me? I thought he deserved a chair. Then her parents and I made a hopeless attempt to put our lives together without 2 of God's best and brightest angels. We buried them next to each other in a small cemetery. Her family could afford a mausoleum, but the beauty of the place, located right on the shores of Lake St. Clair, was irresistible. It was so peaceful. I sat with them for hours in all kinds of weather, talking to them, crying bitter tears and begging God, "Why them, you son of a bitch?" After an unimaginable catastrophe, there is no turning back. You have no future, no hope. You drag out a miserable existence, sucking the light from the remnants of your days, and pray for a quick end. I was 30 years old and irrevocably broken, a walking dead man. I had a pile of settlement money and was determined to succeed, to honor their memory. So, acting quite normal, at least outwardly, I started an engineering firm and worked 16 hours a day to expand the business. Sleep was just a habit. And what else did I have? Paradoxically, the company grew to the point where we were soon doing multi-million-dollar construction projects. The IPO made me extremely wealthy, but I was still broke. No amount of money could bring my loved ones back. It's been a while. I was the nominal head of the firm. It was my money and mostly my ideas, but I was too personally flawed to be trusted to make any practical decisions. So I was given the title founder and consultant. It was a ploy for shareholders to get this fruitcake into the pasture and keep it there. When your world breaks down, you become completely obnoxious. So you become obsessed with the idea of orderliness, perhaps in response to the seeming chaos around you. So I was constantly looking into our projects to make sure everything was done right. No one wanted me there. I was considered a nerd. But no one could tell me to fail because I owned the company. With my own airplane, it was easier to get to where I was doing various things. So I took lessons and got my VFR, IFR, and CFI ratings with a complex certificate. Flying became another of my odd hobbies, and I quickly became a master aviator. Then it was just me and my trusty Piper Cherokee. I chose this place because I liked the name of the company. It made me feel closer to my daughter. The Cherokee is a rugged and tolerable machine. With its 180 horsepower Lycoming engine, fixed pitch propeller and trimmers, It can be driven by trained baboons. So flying from our Miami office to construction sites in the Bahamas was more like a commute. However, this day has been particularly strange. First, there was the weird weather, and now some nutjob in a vintage military airplane is forcing me to land where I don't want to. A guy in a Warhawk took me across the coast to a real dirt landing strip in what I assumed was Florida. It was located on a promontory north of what I assumed was Port Canaveral. I saw Quonset huts and a rudimentary tower, but had no idea what frequency ATC was on, so I just circled around to leeward, turned around on approach, and landed. If the Cherokee has a flaw, it's that it's too buoyant. The Hershey bar-like ground effect on the wings makes it float forever. And it was a relatively short field. Of course, I never cared whether I survived or died, which allows me to fly without worrying about crashes. In fact, if it weren't for my fear of the unknown, I probably would have killed myself by now. But still, karma has a way of mocking me, and I seem to be facing another one of its blows. A military vehicle sped toward me. I lowered the flaps, dropped the wheels, and pressed the control lever again. They chased me down the runway as the Cherokee pulled gingerly toward the ground. I came to a stop dangerously close to the end of the runway, jumped out of the cockpit door onto the right wing in a righteous rage. I yelled, "What the fuck do you assholes think you're shooting down a private citizen in unrestricted airspace?" All I could hear was the clanking of the M1 bolts. I froze in mid-tirade. A guy with a gold oak leaf on his collar walked over to where I was standing on the wing, looked me over from head to toe, and said gruffly, "Steigen Sie aus dem Flugzeug." I think it was in German. I said irritably, "I don't speak German. Tell me in English what the hell is going on here." The guy gave me a testy look and said, "Get off the plane, Fritz, or we'll take you off it." Half an hour later, I was sitting in the walled-off part of the Quonset hut. My first thought was, where's the air conditioning? It was beastly hot in there. They sat me in a staff car between a couple of stout MPs and then drove me to what looked like a command headquarters. Not a word was said. The MPs then dragged me into the building and pushed me not too gently into a room. There was a metal table with 3 chairs. I didn't think we were going to have tea. Finally, the door opened, and a pair of minions burst into the room. They were followed by 2 gorillas. They took up position at the door, arms crossed, looking like a pair of stone statues in front of a pharaoh's tomb. The suits took the 2 chairs opposite me and gave me an appraising look. The eldest of them resembled a hamster, but quite kind and intelligent. His companion was a very different rodent. A weasel. I said, trying to sound reasonable. "Could one of you please explain what's going on? Why are you treating me this way? I haven't done anything wrong." Weasel snorted and said, as if asking a rhetorical question, "Flying in restricted airspace isn't bad. Gee, maybe we should change the rules. And what's that thing you're flying, some kind of Messerschmitt?" I laughed out loud and said, "That's a Piper Cherokee, buddy. I know the model is obsolete, but you should recognize the type." "What's the story with the restriction? It looks like Port Canaveral over there," I added, getting even more angry. "There's nothing military in that area except Cape Kennedy. How can a private airplane flying at sea violate all that?" They both looked at each other, as if wondering what the fuck I was talking about. Then the hamster said, "Listen, Fritz, you and I both know that our ICBM test program takes place on the Cape. Have you been scouting it out? Can we expect a visit from your AR-234S? I stopped for a second and just stared at it. I was a bit of a military history buff, at least before Armageddon put an end to everything. And I knew that the AR-234 Blitz was the only operational jet bomber that flew during World War II. Was it one of those Nazi wonder weapons that Hitler was counting on to turn the tide of the war against the Allies? I said warily, "Nazi bombers, you must think it's 1944. Weasel hummed and said, "I wish. Maybe things would be different now." Okay, so the whole thing was a farce. It was supposed to be World War II reenactors, and I was starting to get tired of their game, so I said, annoyed, "When now?" Hamster said with a look like he didn't like being fiddled with. "Come on, Fritz. You know it's 1962. A wave of irritation swept over me. Oh shit. I wasn't in Kansas anymore. At least I had the good sense not to blurt out that I was from a 60-year-old future. But maybe I wasn't. Apparently it was a completely separate universe. Similar to mine, but not quite the same. Maybe they calculated the date differently. I'm an engineer. I plan and act based on data. So far, the only information I had gotten was that the US seemed to be at war with Germany. Why and why not remained a mystery. But I began to get a creepy feeling about how I might have gotten there. When I encountered this strange fog, I was within the boundaries of the legendary Bermuda Triangle. In fact, I was flying almost the same course as the 5 TBMs that disappeared there in 1945. So maybe the Bermuda Triangle did exist after all, like some random phenomenon that pops up from time to devour ships and airplanes. I thought about all this while 2 bureaucrats pressed me to admit that I was a German spy. I needed more information, so I said, trying to sound reasonable, "What makes you think I was spying for the Germans?" At least that would let me know what they were thinking. They laughed and said, "The airplane you flew in looks like a variant of the Me-108, and you were right over the place where our test missiles fall. What were you doing there, Fritz? Making a map so the Huns could reconstruct our research?" I said, starting to get annoyed. "Stop calling me Fritz. My name is Eric." They both nodded sagely. Hamster said, "That's a good German name." I said, "It's German because I was born and raised in Beloit. A lot of Germans settled there. I have a construction company in Miami, and I was flying from Nassau to the Fort Lauderdale airport before you clowns intercepted me." The weasel said gleefully, as if I'd finally made a fatal mistake, "Okay, smartass, if you are who you say you are, give us your fingerprints and we'll run them. And then, after we find nothing, you tell us who you really are." Shit, no ID proves I'm not from around here. I was stuck in that stifling hot room for the entire time it took to get the prints. Meanwhile, my 2 mute friends were standing at the door, looking as if they expected me to be about to run off to a Bund meeting. I was nervous. Think about it. How would you react if you were cozying up in one world, no matter how miserable it was? And then you mysteriously find yourself in another, where you're about to be shot as a spy. The emotional blow was brutal. Nevertheless, the situation was becoming even more puzzling. Upon returning, the bureaucrats apologized profusely. Hamster said in a much friendlier tone, "We didn't know you were the guy." Then he added, "But it says here that you're dead. What is this? How could I have a past in this world if I didn't exist here? A copy of me, perhaps a doppelganger, was living my life in this world? And what's worse, he's dead now. Oh, woe is me. What shall I do? I was desperate to get away from these guys, so the only way out for me was to bluff. But that's my instinct." I chuckled and said, as if between us boys, "In the immortal words of Mark Twain, reports of my death have been greatly exaggerated." Everyone laughed, even the guards. This was clearly my chance to get out of Dodge. I said, "So I'm free?" and stood up. They were off balance now, and I wanted to keep the momentum on my side. The 2 henchmen looked at each other, and Weasel hesitantly said, "I think so. We've confirmed that you've always been a wealthy businessman, so you're clearly not a Nazi spy." It sounded strange to me. In my world, the Nazis were long gone, at least at first glance. I wondered if they had settled in some back corner of American culture as they had in mine. I said, as if I were deeply offended, "Of course not." Then I added in a voice that brooked no objection, "I'm leaving, and you 2 will replace the fuel I burned when you distracted me. I was entering my role as an outraged citizen, and from a practical standpoint, I'm really going to need more gasoline to fly the 200 miles back to Fort Lauderdale." On the way back to the Piper, I had much less company. In fact, it was just me and my navigation charts. I got in the airplane, put on my harness and headset, turned on the fuel pump, pressed the gas pedal, and started the engine. I checked the pressure on the gauges, all normal, and revved it up to 2300 as I taxied onto the dirt runway. There was no ATC to serve me, but there was no visible traffic in the area either. So I pressed the throttle to takeoff speed and soared up over the Atlantic. I knew I was going to have a hard time coping with this brave new world, a world in which I existed but never lived. Nevertheless, I felt a sense of exhilaration. The loss of my former life should normally have crushed me, if I hadn't already lost everything. Yet, strangely enough, I felt as if I had been given a fresh start. It was a different page of storytelling. In fact, it was a whole new book. I was completely free of sadness and pain. I had nothing but new challenges in front of me, and the sense of liberation gave me hope. So, I felt a strange sense of peace for the first time since that unspeakable bastard in the tanker truck had ended my happiness. The drive along the coast gave me time to think. Back at the airbase, I'd been scrambling around, trying to keep my eyes on the situation. Now I was thinking more long-term and strategically. I knew that I would need a place to live and money to live on. So the first thing I did was to acquire those two necessities. I've been told I'm rich. Perhaps the version of me in this dimension led exactly the same lifestyle as me. Seriously. Logically speaking, it was a parallel universe. So all the fundamental aspects must be identical, right? I had no idea how and when I came off my deathbed in this dimension. Consequently, there was no way to prepare a story explaining my miraculous resurrection. Therefore, I would have had to play every situation by ear. But fortunately, I really was that guy, right down to my fundamental DNA. And yet there remained the problem of personal history. I didn't know any of the things I had done in this world. Not recognizing your best friend, for example, could raise suspicion, even if you had fingerprints to prove it. But that wasn't a problem for me, because I didn't have any friends, at least not since that sad day. So maybe my past was nothing. I remained who I was, both physically and psychologically. Therefore, it was logical to assume that I was leading the life I was leading, no matter what dimension I was in. That led me to the one thought I'd been trying to avoid about Kat. What would I do if she were alive? And if she was, how would I find her? And what would happen after I did? The dynamics of parallel universes require that all the major events of your life be similar. So Kat undoubtedly existed here, perhaps along with Piper. Or maybe they died in this timeline too. Not twice. The thought was too painful to contemplate. The only thing I knew for sure was that I was dead in their space, and that was probably why I could cross dimensions. After all, the theory of relativity is pretty clear that the same object cannot occupy the same space at the same time. Another thing I knew for sure was that my head would explode if I kept thinking about it any longer. When I arrived at the Fort Lauderdale airport, it was already dark, and the runway lights were off as I made my approach. For most pilots, the lack of visibility would have been a problem. But I knew this approach like my driveway. Nevertheless, as I crossed the edge of the runway to land lightly, I immediately noticed a problem. The landing lights of my Piper were illuminating another airport. For one thing, it was clearly military. There was no commercial terminal, and actual operations were reduced to 2 intersecting runways and a control tower, along with the ubiquitous Quonset huts. There were a few rudimentary hangars, but no permanent buildings. I pulled onto the grass where the terminal stood and shut off the engine. The abrupt silence and darkness were frightening. My only companions were 10 million cicadas, several billion mosquitoes, and the mild Florida night. There was no movement nearby. Besides the fact that it was dark as hell here, the smell of mangrove swamps was something new. It was like I was in the undeveloped Florida of the 1940s, rather than the modern mecca of hedonism it had become. I already knew I was in a different world. This new view confirmed it. Then I saw a sedan heading toward the control tower. I didn't have an ATC frequency, so I did not request a landing spot. The authorities must have wondered why the strange airplane landed without permission. The car looked like an old Ford. It even had blackout curtains. I felt like I was in the set of a World War II movie. All I needed was the swirling fog. Some grubby guy got out of his car and walked over to where I was putting my bird away. He looked like he was a security guard who had come out to see what was going on. He wasn't military, like the place I'd just flown from. He said in a nasally southern accent, "This is a military airport, y'all. You're not supposed to land here." Apparently he was a local roughneck looking out for an empty airfield. I'd been through this farce once before, so I was prepared for it. I laughed and said, like it was the most normal thing in the world, "Sorry about that, buddy, but I was just running out of fuel. I'll reschedule it for the morning," and went back to my post-flight checklist. He stood there, not knowing what to do next. Then he shrugged and turned to the car, saying over his shoulder, "Make sure you do that." "Ah," I said, just as nonchalantly. "Could you give me a ride to Lauderdale, buddy? I guess it's too late to call a cab." It was another bluff. I was going to have to walk 6 miles to my house on New River if he didn't want to give me a ride. He laughed and said, "Sure, just buy me a beer when we get there." I said, "Let's go," and jumped into the cabin. Apparently, in this dimension, Broward County International Airport was a provincial place if the guy they'd hired to monitor it could just cut loose for a drink. I didn't have any money to spend, so even beer would have been a problem if I hadn't pawned my Rolex, and that's when inspiration hit me. I could buy everything I needed at home. It made a lot of sense. I had a lot of cash stored in the safe. And really, seriously, I supposedly lived there. The man was about 20 years older than me. He was so unkempt that it was hard to determine his exact age. He was clearly a local from the Glades, talkative and friendly. They make their living in the Everglades, doing God knows what with the local fauna, mostly fishing and alligator hunting. I said carelessly, "The airport has changed since the last time I was here." He had no idea. He laughed and said, "They've improved it. Now the government does anti-submarine patrols here, so they paved the runways and even built a PBY hangar." I took him at his word. It was too dark to see anything. But this place was nothing like the modern one I had flown out of last week. I directed him to my house. At the time, it was a 10-minute drive. He was impressed. In my measurement, the house cost me $15 million. Even so, it wasn't the biggest or grandest in the neighborhood. There was big money in the neighborhood, and had been for generations. As we drove down the circular road, the house was dark. No one seemed to live there. I knew my current key wouldn't work, or maybe it would, but I always kept a spare under a pot of Monstera delicata by the door. If I, living in this world, was really there. I could only hear the bugs chirping as I carefully moved the pot, and bingo, the key was there. It gave me a new confidence, for it confirmed that I had once been a part of this world. I now had a real sense of presence that reinforced me. I opened the door and cautiously stepped inside. This was the tipping point. Most people in Florida were armed, at least in my day, and I'd have to do something if the owner wasn't me. But I'd been told he was dead, and if that was the case, I'd round third base and head for home. The thing is, it's a lot easier to start over if you already have tons of money and an established identity. So, unless the version of me in this dimension wasn't around to say otherwise, I could take on all the trappings of my doppelganger's life. The house was hot and musty, like any other place if it had been closed for a long time. The light switch was to the right of the door. I fumbled for it in the dark, and it was in place. The overhead chandelier illuminated the chic, elegant room. My new buddy followed me into the room, looked around, and ahead. I said, trying to sound casual, "Sit down, I need to change." He flopped down on the couch, still looking around, as if he'd never seen such splendor. My bedroom was by the pool on the first floor at the back of the building. I didn't need a change of clothes, but the safe was there, and I wanted to grab a few things. I hoped that I would find what I was looking for in there. It would confirm that I now belonged to this dimension. I turned the picture on the wall by the dressing room door and made sure the safe was exactly where I expected it to be. I twiddled the dial. I always used the same combination. This was the moment when I would either confirm that I was now well settled in this dimension, or realize that I was really screwed. I slowly turned the dial to the last digit. The toggle switches clicked, and the safe opened. The transition into this world was complete. It was like that feeling you get when you reach a safe harbor after a particularly deadly storm. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. There was a wad of cash in the safe along with other valuables. I plucked a handful of bills and stuffed them into my wallet. Then I tossed the money I'd brought from the other world into my sock drawer. When the evidence of my past life was safely buried under a pile of argyles, I returned to my new life. The hillbilly sat on the couch, his eyes empty and his mouth ajar. It seemed as if he might be dead, but I knew that was just his version of thinking. I said cheerfully, "You know, I've been traveling, and I have a bunch of things to do tomorrow. So why don't we just have a drink here? You should probably be getting back to the airfield anyway." The guy's eyes became like saucers as I pulled out a bottle of Chivas and poured him 3 fingers. He took a sip of my expensive whiskey and said, "Man, that's smooth." I took a sip from the finger I had poured myself and said, "Yep." Getting this dude drunk would have been easy. I needed information, and my new acquaintance was the most suitable source. He wasn't exactly bright, and as he got drunk, he understood less and less. So I planned to keep pouring scotch down his throat until I was sure he wouldn't blink an eye if I told him I was from Tatooine, which in many ways was just as likely as my real origin. Now, it was time for this redneck to tell me a bit of history, if indeed he knew it. I said, "It's stuffy in here. Why don't we sit by the pool and talk? You give the impression of a man who knows his business, and I want to get your opinion on what these people have gotten us into." What the hell? Why not flatter the guy? The "those people" I was referring to remained unspecified, but guys like him always have a "they," and it's usually a gummy mint. I turned on the decorative poolside lights as we stepped out onto the deck. I didn't have to think about where anything lay. It was instinctive. I was completely me in this dimension. We sat down in a couple of lounge chairs, and I offered him a big fat panatella. He lit up and puffed for a minute, sipping my scotch. He was obviously very drunk. Then I ventured into conversation. "What do you think really caused the trouble with the Germans?" I would have answered Hitler, but I needed my questions to be as vague as possible. He let out a cloud of smoke, took another sip of my expensive whiskey, and said, "From what I understand, it all started with the election of Lindbergh in the 40s. Wow. Charles Lindbergh was president. It must have been very much a populist movement. Lucky Lindy was an international celebrity, but he was also the king of American firsters and an egregious racist and anti-Semite. Of course, that's how you could characterize much of the United States in 1940, so maybe it wasn't so shocking. But this guy had no qualifications whatsoever to lead the country." My tipsy friend muttered, "In those days, we were all in favor of isolationism. There was an Atlantic Ocean between the US and Europe, so we could sit back and not worry about what was going on over there." He smirked, the way true fools smirk when they expound their particular version of wisdom, and added, "We were all in agreement with Lindy. You heard. Nobody wanted anything to do with that dirty European war. Joe Kennedy was Secretary of Defense at the time, and he curtailed the armed forces so as not to provoke the Nazis, and saved us a lot of money. You bet he did. That explains a lot. Lindbergh was a famous aviator, not a strategic thinker. He had no background in geopolitics. Although he made a lot of money after his famous flight, he still had a minimal understanding of the world from the Midwest. He would have been easy prey for Hitler and his minions. To make matters worse, Joe Kennedy was no statesman. He had made his family fortune in bootlegging and was Irish to the core. Ireland wanted independence, and Kennedy knew that a pro-German or even strictly neutral US position would be a disaster for the British. Therefore, any plausible pretext would do. I was disgusted with what I had heard so far. Still, I wanted my tipsy friend to keep talking, because he was filling in some important blanks. I gave him a go-ahead gesture and said, trying to sound impatient, as if I already knew it all, "But what does this have to do with where we are now?" He looked at me like I was an idiot, and said incredulously, "Hey, kid, you mean to tell me you don't know that the English surrendered as well as the French?" He paused and added with undisguised respect, "But it took them 9 long years to wave the white flag." Then he snorted and added, "Instead of the 6 weeks it took the frogs." I replied high-handedly, "Of course I do." The scenario in which Britain would be left alone was discussed in my dimension, under the heading, "What if?" And the conclusion was always the same. Without US help, Britain had neither the men nor the resources to stand up to the Axis forever. My companion laughed and said caustically, "They lasted a lot longer than we all expected. We thought they were a bunch of cowards with their superiority and snotty accent, but thanks to the U-boat blockade and the fact that we left them to their own devices, they finally gave up." I was starting to like this guy less and less. My drunken buddy continued, "That freed up all the German tanks for Russia. Stalin didn't think his buddy Hitler would stab him in the back. Ha! The Nazis took the communists out of the war in less than a year, just like WWI." He poured himself another glass and said, "These steps were perfect for tanks. It only took the Nazis 9 months to go all the way from the Polish border to the Ural Mountains. Most people think it would have been different if that part of the war had dragged on into winter." I metaphorically beat myself over the head as my grisly friend spoke. How could people in this dimension be so stupid? But I had to sit there looking like the two of us were reminiscing about the good old, or perhaps a more appropriate term would be ignorant, days. He added, looking at me suspiciously, I know you remember when they invaded Iceland. I was watching his schedule. 9 years, plus 2 more for Russia, plus a couple years to prepare, and said, sure, that was in 53, right? He looked as if I had answered something more than his simple question. He said, yes, it was awkward. The Germans just showed up and took over. I thought they, the Vikings, were tough, and they turned out to be wimps. I estimate that there were about 300,000 men, women, and children on the entire island. I bet the Germans landed more troops in the first wave. I understood what would happen next. Iceland would provide the Reich with the perfect springboard to invade Canada. The justification would be that Canada was Commonwealth territory, and therefore belonged to them. After all, the Nazis now owned the British Navy, so Germany rules the waves. I said, I remember that. That was what eventually started the national mobilization. I guessed, but not unreasonably, that the appearance of the Nazi army in Canada would lead to the beginning of events in the United States, and I had to start speaking knowledgeably. The dude took another long sip from the bottle, which he was now drinking straight from the neck, and said, yeah, that's right. That was after the invasion of Newfoundland. By then, public opinion had shifted from appeasement to war. Eisenhower was vice president when Lindbergh died of a stroke, and he took over. He leaned back in his chair and said wistfully, Ike sure knew how to organize an army. I said it was in 55, if I remember correctly. I guessed, but I wanted to continue the conversation, so I made an estimate based on what he told me. He laughed and said, where have you been, buddy? It was 57. We were already at war with the damn Japs, but like you said, we were afraid of the Germans. Oh crap, I forgot about the Japanese. But my village friend had already decided that I was an ignorant rich guy, just like all the other unjustifiably rich losers. So he kept talking. He said angrily, those damn Japs made a secret deal with the Mexicans, allowing them to land as many as 3 armies in the south of this country, far enough away that we wouldn't notice. Fortunately, they invaded the Arizona desert east of the Rocky Mountains, and General MacArthur's troops held the passes into California and Nevada, leaving the Japs stuck in the middle of all those lizards, snakes, and heat. He took another puff and added, then, in 58, the Arizona, Oklahoma, and the rest of the squadron's battleships caught up with the main Japanese supply fleet off Ensenada and defeated it. That same week, the Lexington, Yorktown, and Wasp sank all of their aircraft carriers off Midway. It was a coordinated attack and our first step in fighting back. He grinned and added, because of that, a lot of Japanese ended up on a foreign continent, and supply lines were cut, so they just set up store in Mexico. Now they call it New Yamato. He cast a baleful glance and added, the Japanese have become violent ever since they took over Central America. That's why they still have a hard time suppressing the revolutions that keep breaking out there. No one in South America wants them. And that's good news for us, because it keeps the nips out of our business while we deal with the Krauts. I was already pretty good at guessing events based on what I had already heard. I said, have I forgotten the name of the treaty that nailed the Japanese back to the other side of the Rio Grande? The boy absent-mindedly replied, Monterrey. That was it. The Americans and Canadians were fighting the Wehrmacht in the wilds of Quebec, while the Japanese were sitting on our southern border, putting out fires in their own section and waiting for a new opportunity to invade. At least that explained the paranoid reaction when I just appeared on the military's radar. Logically, it wasn't quite like that in my dimension. The fact that I was in a parallel universe with 40s technology was probably due to the fact that we were still fighting World War II. You were putting your resources into bullets and guns, not into improving consumer goods. Still, there was a time travel aspect to the story. Anyway, this was my reality now, and after the most eventful day of my life, I was exhausted. Luckily, my rat guest was already out, lying with his head thrown back, snoring like a blast furnace, saliva dripping from his open, almost toothless mouth. So I just went to the same bed I'd woken up from a couple days ago, in a completely different universe. The difference was that I was able to fall asleep, as I hadn't been able to do since that horrible day when my life stopped making sense. I woke up as usual, yawned, stretched, and then I was hit like a cartoon safe had fallen on my head. I was in a familiar bedroom, but not in my usual world. The sun was shining, as it always does in Florida, and it was getting hot. I remembered that air conditioning was rare here. This was going to take some getting used to. I put on shorts and a t-shirt, which of course fit me, and went to see if I had killed yesterday's spine runner. He must have come in sometime before dawn, because he was gone, and so was his car. The bottle of my good scotch was gone too. I didn't think that was a coincidence. I was sipping my first cup of coffee, which I had to make with an old-fashioned percolator and stove, when there was a knock on the door. Or rather, knocked on the door. I kind of expected it, so I wasn't surprised when, upon opening the door, I found a bulldog in a sheriff's uniform standing at the entrance. He cried out, shocked, "What the hell?" and almost fell off the porch. I said that if law enforcement always showed up on my doorstep, "Good morning, Sheriff. Would you like some coffee?" He continued to stand there with his mouth open. At last he shook himself and said, "But you're dead. I saw you being transported after the accident, so that's the reason for his surprise." "Well, I'd better come up with a good story," I said. "You were almost right. I was getting pretty good at faking it, but trying to excuse my death didn't help this guy at all." He said incredulously, "When we were informed that your place was taken, I decided to go in and see for myself. But I never expected to find you here. What a story. Why did you come back, and how are you alive anyway?" I was improvising, but the riff was getting easier and easier. I knew that in those days, record keeping was limited to paper files, so it made sense to just lie. The sheriff would have to dig through a bunch of old records to disprove my story, and he didn't look good. I said, like I couldn't believe he didn't know that. "Didn't they tell you that?" Then I stopped, and theatrically, as if pondering, said, "Well, I guess they wouldn't. It was no longer a law enforcement matter." The sheriff looked both confused and furious, so I added with a creepy chuckle, "I actually woke up on the undertaker's table. I've been told that happens sometimes." He looked at me in disbelief and was about to say something, so I hastily continued. They were already preparing to embalm me when I opened my eyes. It scared the hell out of everyone. Again, the creepy laughter. I added, "Maybe I am immortal, do you think?" The sheriff was clearly starting to buy my spirited story. I added, trying to look like I was reminiscing, "I was in rough shape for a long time, and it took months of rehabilitation. But now I'm here, and everything is fine." I thought the little self-deprecating platitude at the end was a nice touch. I added tentatively, because it was really a question, "Did anyone miss me?" He laughed out loud and said, "Who's going to miss an asshole like you?" Okay, that was a little hurtful and very cryptic. I asked anxiously, "Didn't Kat miss me?" I just assumed Kat was alive. After all, my house was still the same, and I looked as wealthy as ever. It was inconceivable that she'd accidentally died in both worlds. As my old man used to say, lightning never strikes twice, Eric. But where was she? The sheriff asked, puzzled. "Why the fuck are you worrying about whether the cat missed you?" I said, trying to be polite, even though I was beginning to feel like I was talking to an idiot. "No. Kat, my wife." He was laughing so hard that 3 of his chins were shaking. He looked at me as if he still thought I was teasing him and said, "As far as I know, you don't have a wife. Of course, with all those pussies you've been walking around here, I suppose one of them could have been a real cat." Well, it was weird. What kind of person was me in this dimension? I knew I was that guy in every way, but we obviously had a very different approach to marriage. The sheriff was starting to make me nervous. He was the local authority, and he obviously knew me from my old life, so he could have gotten wind of my story, so I wanted him off my doorstep and out of my life as soon as possible. Before he asked me a question, I couldn't answer. I said hurriedly, as if I had something vital to do, "If the sheriff has nothing else, I really have to go. I left my plane at the Broward airport last night, and I need to get there as soon as possible to secure it." He looked me over one last time, as if still not believing I was alive. Finally, he tapped the brim of his round hat and said, "Well, have a good day." And turning on his heels, he strode back to his black and white car. I worked out a plan as I walked to my garage. Inside were 2 cars, a white 1955 Cadillac Coupe Devil with tail fins soaring, and a powder blue 1956 Thunderbird convertible. Both looked like they had just rolled off the assembly line. I chose the bird simply because I liked the way it looked, and the heat of the new day suggested that the top had better be down. There wasn't a single air conditioner in this dimension. I hadn't eaten in almost 24 hours. So my first stop was Howard Johnson's on the Atlantic. That was 1962. Where else could I get a quick breakfast? Then I went to the Broward County Public Library. Of course, there were no computers there. There were only card catalogs back then. But I collected local newspapers from 2 years ago. Thanks to Sheriff Grissom, I got an approximate date. It wasn't what I thought it would be. A July 31st, 1960 article described a ghastly accident involving a drunken fool. Me, in an Arena Craft fiberglass ski boat and a rock jetty at the entrance to Lauderdale Harbor on the Stanahan River. I realized why the sheriff was confused. Apparently, I had been thrown from the boat onto the rocks and was pronounced dead at the scene. The article mentioned that I was the 30-year-old heir to millionaire real estate developer Stanford Grayson III, owner of multiple hotels on Miami Beach. Wow. In another reality, my old man, Stanley, owned a hardware store. It mentioned that I was married to Catherine Grayson, age 28, but it didn't say what had happened to her or where she was now. The wave of relief that swept through me was indescribable. I really feared I had lost Kat in 2 dimensions. As you might expect, things were different in this dimension, but the players were the same. I spent hours scouring every possible resource for any trace of my wife, but she was nowhere to be found. Meanwhile, I still had to do something about my airplane. That's when I discovered another of these differences. In this world, 911 was still 40 years in the future. Therefore, there were no guards at the gate, so I could just drive up to where my airplane was parked on the grass by the runway. I was making my post-flight rounds when I saw a Jeep heading my way. It was one of those old-fashioned Willys models you see in World War II movies. The guy behind the wheel looked like a regular army soldier, tall, trim, and no nonsense. I started talking as soon as he got out of the Jeep. I said, "Sorry about that, boss, but I ran out of fuel, so I had to make an emergency landing." The guy looked me over with a slight smile, like I was a green recruit. He was a few inches shorter than me and about the same weight, muscular with a chiseled face. He had 2 silver stripes on his collar. He said, "Welcome, dear viewers, to our fascinating journey through parallel dimensions and unexpected twists and turns. In the first part of our story, the protagonist found himself in a world both familiar and profoundly different from his own, as you can get to such a world by following the link in the description and joining our community on Patreon. Fleeing from dubious characters, he regained his identity as a wealthy businessman, but soon discovered that this reality was shaped by historical deviations when Lindbergh's presidency and unforeseen global events changed the course of history. As our hero coped with the challenges of this brave new world, he encountered an unusual sheriff who believed him to be long dead. With quick thinking and improvisation, our protagonist managed to convince the sheriff of his miraculous resurrection, leaving us with a mystery about his supposed demise. Now, as he delves deeper into the intricacies of this alternate reality in search of information about his past and the whereabouts of his wife Kat, new revelations emerge. The geopolitical landscape is changing dramatically, with Lindbergh's isolationist policies leading to unexpected consequences, including the domination of Germany and the transformation of America. Against the backdrop of these revelations, our protagonist is faced with the need to fit into the life he once lived, but of which he now knows little. Tension builds when he meets an enigmatic figure at the airport, a military man with a commanding and inquisitive gaze. While we eagerly await the denouement of this gripping narrative, remember that the full uncensored version is available on our Patreon, where you can support the channel and get access to exclusive content. Stay tuned for the next episodes, where secrets will be revealed and the journey through the parallel dimension will continue. In the meantime, stay curious and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more exciting stories.